Okay, now it's my turn. I'm going to have a presentation on the issue of uncertainty or uncertainties relating to the work with local climate change adaptation. And by doing so, discussing that issue, I will also discuss more in general ideas about how to sort of approach the whole task or the whole idea of adapting to climate change. So first, say some words about what uncertainty is or could be in a climate change context. Try to suggest a type of sort of typology of uncertainty, not using too scientific concepts, more concepts that are sort of can be handled in practical situations. Give some practical experiences from trying to cope with uncertainties in climatic and also related projects, and I will have most of my concrete examples from Norway. A small reflection on how important is the issue of uncertainty in sort of a practical day-to-day situation when you're going to decide on this or this adaptation option or strategy. And some final thoughts about new approaches to handle, which could perhaps help us to handle the issue of uncertainty in some way, better way or more constructive way. What is uncertainty? Basically, it's about the questions we ask and the answers we try to give them. And trying to identify sort of the 6 basic questions in climate change adaptation debate. First, is the climate changing? And why is the climate changing? Is it man-made or natural variation? How is the climate changing? Where does specified climate changes take place? For instance, in Flora compared to Norway, compared to global. And in what ways may climate change affect us? And the last, what can we do about this? Very basic questions, but it might be important to bear them in mind when we're trying to identify uncertainties, because each of these questions have a different type of uncertainty linked to it. And it tends to, the public debate on uncertainty tends to be sort of linked with one of the 2 first questions, or reduced to only the 2 first. Within the IPCC, there's a concept called uncertainty explosion. And the point here is that what we often tend to focus on in the public debate to the far left is sort of the smallest in one way, uncertainty, and it sort of adds up when we move to the right. So does this insight lead to action? Does it help us to decide, or does it lead to sort of paralyze us, saying, well, this is just enormous amount of uncertainties, we can't do anything with this. So my challenge will be to try to sort of cut this explosion into smaller pieces so it could be more easy to handle it. It's like eating an airplane. You can't eat it at once, but if you cut it into small pieces, you might be able to do it. First is how to describe the complexity of uncertainty, and the second is how to make decisions in a situation with specified type of uncertainty. A typology of uncertainty we've been working with in now many projects on climate change adaptation. I've tried to sort of sum it up in a more popular version. First, we can differ between different natures of uncertainty. It can be sort of very basic. I'm not sure if that is the good word, but some things it's just not possible to say the cause-effect mechanisms, and it's perhaps not possible to predict any kind of certainty or uncertainty. We have something called model uncertainty, meaning that we know the cause and effect, basic relations, but we haven't good enough models to sort of describe what might be happening. And then there's a data uncertainty. We have good models, but we have not enough data to use the model. And there's of course the natural variability that we always have to cope with. Then there is sort of a new axis which I will call location of uncertainty. Each of these four, or could we have more categories of nature of uncertainty, they could be located different places. It could be located in different places in a sort of a ideal cause-effect chain, or it could be located at a different geographical level. For instance, we know that Norway will have X% more, might have X% more rainfall for the next 50 years or whatever, but there's a very difficult to say if we will get more or less rain west coast, east part of Norway, because of we don't know how the low pressure pattern will be. And there's also a sort of a communication uncertainty from research on sustainable indicators, especially local sustainable indicators. There's a concept of hot and cold developed, meaning you have to sort of balance between very accurate and scientific accurate indicators that could be very complicated and indicator that has a high resonance for decision makers, but they are perhaps not that accurate. And this is also a sort of a uncertainty issue as well. And there is what I call the time problem, that especially for adaptation is very typical, and also for mitigation, that the costs are very near, but the possible benefits are often many years ahead. And if we use the normal methods of assessing the economic benefit of such thing, and the benefits tends to be reduced to a very small number. So that's also a sort of an uncertainty issue. Can this help us to sort of make an uncertainty map? If we start with the sort of connection between the global, there is a notion of a global climate change, and there is the local community we want to sort of address and work with. So we have developed sophisticated systems of downscaling climate change, and we have knowledge of how to assess the possible effects of climate change on changes in nature and effects on society. In Clim ATIC, we have tried to develop a sort of a parallel here. It's an intuitive thing, but it's difficult to make it make it operational. But still, the society is also changing, and there could be a parallel sort of downscaling of socioeconomic change, which will make society more or less exposed to climate change. And on that, those two sort of combined effect, we will have to decide on adaptation measures. And all of these boxes and links have their possible uncertainties. So here is, I'm not going through all these red boxes, but the point is that this shows the challenge of locating uncertainty to different parts of sort of ideal cause-effect change. And some of these issues are more relevant for local authorities, others are for sort of the larger scientific community, or IPCC, or national government, or somebody outside local community to sort of handle. And with that kind of background, we have been trying to sort of pinpoint some practical issues of uncertainty, with most reference for Norwegian municipalities, in the sense that it's trying to capture the specific climatic changes taking place in Norway, but it could be relevant to other countries as well. It's regarding the global climate change scenarios, will we get more wind? Here we could define it as a model uncertainty. We haven't been able to create good enough climate models to predict if we'll get more or less wind. The specific challenge of downscaling climate scenarios, as I already said, will we get more rain? And this is perhaps more of a basic uncertainty for the case of the patterns between west and eastern part of southern Norway. And it has to do with, as I said, perhaps it's impossible to model how the low pressure will hit Norway, because it's very small changes will make a 100% reverse effect. We might actually, one model say that we might actually get less rain on western part of Norway, whereas other climate models say we will get substantial more. So this is handled by making an average so far on the official internet site for downscaling climate scenarios, and that hides mixes variation and uncertainty, because people might think that the average in some way is more certain than the two extremes, and that's not true, because the two extremes are just as certain as the average. And that is, it runs down to sort of a communication uncertainty, because when I explained this 2 years ago for a meeting with all the heads of the civil defense, regional civil defense departments in Norway, they sort of got angry because they are trained to plan and act towards worst case. Many of them from the military, so they are not interested in these average figures. And we have had much discussions with the meteorologists to make them understand this very, to me, basic and easy thing to handle. And we have been struggling with them to present variation instead of average. And we finally managed to to get that kind of output from the scenario makers. And this point of, which I showed in the previous figure, the interaction between climate and societal change. The whole idea of just asking the question, will expected changes in society make us more or less vulnerable to climate change? I would also call that a communication uncertainty, because it's sort of standard procedure in all kind of planning processes to plan for a changing future. So when presenting for municipalities and other stakeholders, that you need not only to look at this sort of a black box, the climate change scenarios, you will also have to add in what you already are doing, long time planning, and all the basic figures you have there for development in population and whatever. And these two sort of systems has to be combined. And just by sort of presenting that very simple idea, in one way, uncertainty in one way has been reduced, because the local stakeholders see that, okay, I have a role to play here. I know how to do planning, of course. I don't understand perhaps this black box of climate change downscaling, but when I see that there's a role for me to play on socioeconomic changes, okay, then I can act as a planner. The second is more complicated, and we've had a discussion on that, and I noted what you said, Bill, that climate change mitigation and adaptation is sort of critical to linking these two issues. I think there's an interesting discussion here, and my view is that it's important to link mitigation and vulnerability. And the idea is to sort of challenge municipalities and other stakeholders that there is an issue of adapting to more strict, more radical, ambitious mitigation regimes, and that is something different than to actually mitigate. And that might be a way to sort of see the links and to lead an adaptation discussion into a sustainable development discussion. And I'll come back to that point. Okay, uncertainty seems to be a very complicated and complex issue. We have had many discussions with local stakeholders, and there's a very distinct two ways of relating to this. You have sort of the technology, the people working in the technical department, and they say, I can't do anything, I can't develop new roads before you tell me the exact number and the increase in rainfall for the next 20 years. If you don't tell me that, I can't do anything. Whereas people working in the planning department say, well, I'm used to large uncertainties. We have the municipal board saying we want to build a new society hall like this, and they set up for 50 million kroners, and when it's finished it costed 100 million kroner. That's a large uncertainty. That's how life is. And here are some figures that will sort of support the idea that uncertainty is perhaps not that important. This is a survey made where we asked a number of Norwegian municipalities and people working with sustainable development, what are the three main hindrances for working with sustainable development. And you have lots of categories here, and some of these categories has to do implicit or directly with uncertainty. But the number one hindrance is lack of administrative capacity. So perhaps we shouldn't be so afraid of the uncertainty issue. There are other issues that are more sort of pressing when it comes to stopping, hindering activity locally. Okay, finish up with some suggestions and thoughts on how to develop sort of new thoughts, new approaches on handling uncertainty. And first, coming back to this question of connecting climate change mitigation and adaptation. Secondly, to differ between four modes of vulnerability and corresponding four modes of adaptation. And the last, to identify a set sort of a rules of thumbs for prioritizing climate adaptation options. First, sort of the model here to connect climate change and mitigation. A Canadian handbook was published a couple of years ago. They had as a sort of starting point that when dealing with climate change adaptation, we have to do that within the framing of sustainable development. And therefore, we have to talk about mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And their sort of point was quite easy. This is where we ought to be. We have to change society so it's more robust and less carbon intensive. On the other hand, this is where adaptation often is. For instance, in tourism, we have done some studies there, and tourism is a very strange thing because it sort of slips out of many policy documents and strategies, but it's the largest legal business next to sex and yeah, well, it's the largest. Let's just leave it with that. And there are lots of money involved in tourism and in winter tourism, and they don't have any problem of adapting to climate change other than creating more and more emissions, to put it very simple. Another maladaptation or mal policy making here is, as you mentioned from the Netherlands, the example of making new renewable energy, which is very vulnerable to climate change. In Norway, there's a massive focus on literally filling the North Sea with windmills to sort of save the world, and no question whatsoever on the issue of when do we have enough energy. It is only a production issue, not a consumption issue. And this is, of course, business as usual, and that's perhaps where we really are heading now, referring to what you said, Bill. So taking this as a background and going back to the model we have been struggling with, we have been thinking of sort of the missing link here. So the first step would be to add climate change also makes an impact on the global community as a sort of a sum effect, which could have a direct or indirect effect on your local community. One example is climate change could create more climate refugees. It could be have an effect on global food security. It could be other issues that could be sort of transformed as an indirect effect in relation to local community. And there's also, as I've already said, the greenhouse gas mitigation policy that could be defined as an aspect of socioeconomic change. IPCC has not put that into their emission scenarios. No, sorry, the effect, no, the socioeconomic changes that they use to feed into their emission scenarios. And of course, mitigation policies could make society have an effect on the society, in addition to the societies having to do their own mitigation policies. So this would what we see as a sort of a missing link, and I think it's important because I see a sort of a tendency that if we produce local vulnerability assessments only looking at the sort of the local, I mean, what are the local effects of the local climate, we tend to often end up with rather small problems. And those problems does not correspond with at least not with the rhetoric of climate change saying that the world is sort of coming to an end. So I fear that producing more of this local type of vulnerability assessments might produce even more climate skepticism, at least in a country like Norway. But including the sort of indirect effects and also this greenhouse gas mitigation sort of effect might open up the discussion and increase this sort of seriousness of adaptation as a policy issue. So we will get 4 modes of adaptation. Adapt to the effects, building flood protection, what I call a cause-oriented adaptation, that is to change society so it is not that exposed to climate change, and it's to adapt to these indirect effects that are described and also adapt to climate change mitigation policies. So how to prioritize between different main options of climate change adaptation? The first and of course sort of easiest is to adapt to today's climate. And in fact in Norwegian we say, the Norwegian word, we often say klimatilpassing, which means climate adaptation. We often forget the word climate change adaptation. So, and that's a mixture, because when we discuss climate change adaptation, many people think only of climate adaptation, which of course we have done always. That's nature of man, to adapt to climate or nature or whatever conditions. So as you pointed out, it's very important to find what is the additional effect of the changing climate. But to prioritize doing something with this additional effect, we first have to do our home lesson to have done the work with the climate today, because that will sort of, we will not see the partial effect if we don't maintain our roads sufficient today or whatever. And then secondly, when we open up the discussion, we will very soon find that it's important to analyze this more in depth. For instance, the plan in the county of Sogn og Fjordane, many of the adaptation measures was to further analyze vulnerability. And that would be very reasonable in a sort of an early stage of focusing on these issues. And I think you have to learn to, is that in English? You have to learn to crawl before you start to walk? Is that, yeah, okay. So the point is, when you are opening up these policy issues, you will soon see that there's a problem of institutional capacity, illustrated in this municipality for one example. So before you start to try and say that you're going to do something, you have to be sure that you have the capacity to actually do it, unless you will very quickly end up with a negative backlash in a sort of a policy discussion. And then in most cases I would say prioritize planning before concrete action, but that could be changed the other way if, for instance, in Bergen you had a very concrete incident, and by starting working with that landslide incident, that opened the way to get money to actually do planning. So it could actually work either way. But my last point is to try and do as one of the main suggestions from the Brundtland report was to prioritize cause-directed strategies before effect-directed. And that is perhaps the link towards sustainable development, because instead of building flood protection or whatever kind of sort of reactive measures, perhaps we see that the changes in society, in some way, at least in our countries, are a larger challenge than changes in climate. In Flora we made a case study on housing, and our sort of conclusion was that perhaps bad housing is worse than bad climate. So focusing on structural changes, on how society developed, even in an adaptation context, might be the link to the quest for